We left off, I believe, a few pages into lesson 3. So we've talked about a few different things. How many people can recall some of what? Okay, perfect. How many people recall some of the things that we have studied? It's been a couple weeks since we did business meeting last week, but does anyone recall part of lesson 3? And you know what? That's okay. That's what I'm here for, to remind everybody. So we've talked about now some of the persecution that's already gone on. Remember, there was already a mentality of persecution. Does anyone remember how John the Baptist died? He was beheaded, and his head was on a platter. Right after that, Jesus died. And he was horrifically tortured and crucified. The difference? He did raise from the dead. After that, the apostles were all killed, which we looked at, including greatest apostle, Philip. But we also saw Stephen die in Acts chapter 7. And what I believe is one of the greatest messages of all time by our good brother Stephen in chapter 7. And then we looked at some of the ones where maybe it wasn't as the people we knew from the Bible. So on page 2 of lesson 3, we see some highlights about Luke and how important he was. Antipas at the bottom of page 2. Top of page 3, Timothy and what happened there. He was martyred as well. Simon Cleopas, the bottom of page 4. The Ethiopian eunuch, what happened to him there. And that is page 5. And then I believe we ended on page 6. So we're gonna keep diving into this. So this is just sort of an idea for the class. We're gonna progress a little bit in time. And we're going to try to, if we get through all of lesson 4, which we don't, that's fine. The end of lesson 4 will be about the 6th century, okay? So right now we're still in the 1st century, maybe beginning of the 2nd century. We'll get into some of that today. And then we're going to see what has progressed. What has happened? Well, there's an emperor, a Roman emperor, who comes to power named Constantine. We're going to take a minute to kind of go away from the book and talk a little history with the Emperor Constantine. He plays an important role that still exists today. Okay, he had a meeting. We're going to talk about that. Remember, this is history. So as we go through it, think about how history has the ramifications for today. The ideas and plans that Constantine made back in the 4th century, which is when he existed, he was in charge, still affect today. Okay, so as we go through it, think about how this would impact us today. Okay. So we looked at, let's go to the top of page 6. The church is greatly multiplied, disciples increase continuously, but some of the churches continue to go in error. Now, the first of these changes from New Testament teachings embraced both policy and doctrine. So unfortunately, what happens, as the famous saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so what's happening, we're seeing a trend. We see a trend in this 2nd century, this first sort of post-apostles, post-people that maybe were there with Christ, connected with that first group. Those people start to have outside influences. The book of 1 John talks about some of these groups. He was battling a group called the Gnostics. Now, gnosko is simply the Greek word for knowledge or know. You can make that out just from the Greek word. Well, this group was a group called the Gnostics. They were already existing shortly after the time of Christ. This Gnostics group tried to put a spin on what Jesus had taught. So we have a big event, let's say the John F. Kennedy assassination. And everyone's got a different opinion of it. Everyone's got a different view of it, a different spin. The grassy knoll theory, the second shooter theory, the Cubans, the Russians, the FBI, the CIA, or actually John Wilkes Booth, or not John Wilkes Booth. Help me out. Who shot JFK? Not John Wilkes Booth. That was Abraham Lincoln. That was 100 years prior. No.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey. Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Not related to Lee Harvey Osmond. No, the Osmonds were completely different. Lee Oswald. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Man. So too much pasta. That's what it was. Just pasta fatigue. So everyone's got a spin on that event. So this guy comes. He spends 3.5 years healing people, talking to people, leading a group, leading a charge, never taking over Rome, but certainly caused enough disturbance. Well, people then start assessing. People start putting their spin on what he was. One of these groups was called the Gnostics, and they were really trying to they either came out of the church or were trying to influence the church. That they knew what Christ meant. When he said this, he actually meant this, or when he said this, he actually was doing that. So this group sort of multiplies, has an influence on these early New Testament churches. With that comes the Pharisaical idea of power. So keep that in mind. We're starting to see pastors take over multiple churches because they're better leaders, so they can rule these other churches. Or a pastor would be over 10 churches, or a pastor would be over 20 churches with other people underneath. So we start to see this happening early on. In the first 2 centuries, the individual churches rapidly multiplied. In some of the earlier ones, Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, grew to be very large. Some people believe that the Jerusalem church was actually 25 or even 50,000 people. A student of the book of Acts and Epistles will see that Paul had a mighty task even in his day in keeping some of the churches straight. Peter's and Paul's prophecies concerning the future, there was just a lot of people who were following this movement. So 2 Peter 2:12. But these, like natural brute beasts made to be caught and destroyed, speak evil of the things they do not understand and will utterly perish in their own corruption. So here's Peter trying to tackle this pretty much head on. In Acts, it says, "For I know this, that after my departure," this is Paul talking, "savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves men will rise up, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after themselves. Therefore, watch and remember that for 3 years I did not cease to warn everyone day and night with tears." So this is a big concern. Here's 2 verses, one from Peter, one from Paul, talking about people that were going to come in or rise up from the middle. Remember, the devil does not care about false churches. The devil has identified who the Lord's New Testament churches are, and that's who he attacks. He has a bucket of false religion over here. Big bucket of all these false groups. And then there's the few Lord's New Testament churches. What he's trying to do is add to that bucket and get these New Testament churches to fall from inside or outside and come into this bucket of false religion. So we looked at some of the marks. We looked at some of the landmarks last time about what that means. So that's who the devil is pursuing. These great churches necessarily had many preachers. We see that in Acts 20. Some of the bishops or pastors began to assume authority not given to them. They began to claim authority over other and smaller churches. They, with their many elders, began to lord it over God's heritage. So in 3 John, it reads, "I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us well." So we all probably, for those of us who've been church for a long time, know of churches that have fallen by the wayside. They no longer fellowship. They no longer were interested in keeping with the doctrines of Christ. They opened up some of these doctrines, maybe to gain more people, gain more money, gain more power, bigger building, more offerings, whatever. This is common. Unfortunately, has happened many times. Okay. Who would like to take those top 5 bullets above the line on page 7? Top 5 bullets.
There was the beginning of an error which has grown dangerously hurtful errors. Here is the beginning of different orders in the ministry, running up finally to what is practiced now by others as well as the Catholic faith. Here began what resulted in the entire change from the original democratic policy and government of the early churches. This irregularity began in a small way, even before the close of the 2nd century. This was possibly the first serious departure from the New Testament church order.
Doesn't the devil play into people's egos? He plays into ego big time. And in this case, we have pastors who maybe saw smaller churches struggling. It was just this idea of preeminence. I'll be in charge. I'm the one who's going to take over. I'm the one who's here, that sort of thing. The devil's really good at playing into ego, and unfortunately, we see that today. A lot of false religions really follow the lead, typically, of somebody who's very dynamic. We've seen that with leaders over the years. David Koresh didn't seem like someone who would have influenced us because we're all pretty smart, but yet he had a lot of people who followed him, believed that he was the Messiah. Jim Jones, same thing. Didn't seem like brightest of guys, didn't seem like, but he was charismatic. He was dynamic. He talked to people and he really won them over with whatever his philosophy of life was. And so we see this a lot. We see people who simply are Jim and Tammy Baker, another good one, where there was deception there, but people love the power. They love the power. They love what comes with it. And they feel like they have the power to alter what God has clearly established in order to make the word more palatable to more people. If we tweak this or change that, more people will believe. Well, the more people in the pews, the more offerings, the bigger status, the bigger place, the bigger whatever. And so we see that so many times through history. And so unfortunately, it had its roots right after Christ. They didn't mess around. And one of the things, as we're going to see in this next lesson, that baptism was that one thing that was so sacred to the New Testament church that it was stolen and just completely randomized and taken for other means. We'll see that in just a little bit. Any questions so far? Comments? Okay. Who wants to take those? Let's see, we have 8 bullets. Who wants to take the next 4?
Another vital change, which seems from history to have had its beginning before the close of the 2nd century, was on the great doctrine of salvation itself. The Jews, as well as the pagans, have for many generations been trained to lay great stress on ceremonials.
All right, pause right there. Ceremonials. Right? Outward appearances, outward works, outward things that would sort of bring about this idea of salvaging or salvation or a change of life by offering this or doing that. We saw this in the 7 churches. You had a loyalty, you had a feel for, you were on a good list. If you would just offer a sacrifice to a god, offer some sort of penance, offer some sort of admission, those sort of things. It was an outward showing. Remember, the Pharisees were great at this. They took this on, and Jesus called them out for it. Remember, he goes, these Pharisees are doing all this stuff, but I want your heart. That's why we talk so much about that, because Jesus talked so much about it. Jesus talked about wanting hearts. He saw what the Pharisees were doing and called them out. That's trash. I don't want your stuff. Even Israel, remember, Israel was offering sacrifices while offering sacrifices to idols. They were playing this game of back and forth. And so they put pagans and the Jewish leaders at the time were putting great emphasis on an outward showing. I'm going to offer this, I'm going to do that, as a means of some sort of gateway passage known as salvation. All right, go ahead.
They had come to look upon types as antitypes, shadows as real substances, and ceremonials as real saving agencies. How easy to compass to look upon baptism.
Actually, do you want to just take the rest of them, please?
They reason thus, the Bible has much to say concerning baptism. Much stress is laid upon the ordinance and one's duty concerning it. Surely it must have something to do with one's salvation. So that it was in this period that the idea of baptismal regeneration began to get a fixed hold in some of the churches.
Okay. How many people understand this concept? It's a blending together of two things that should be separate. Two ideals. This outward appearance, this outward ceremonial of baptism is actually what saves you. Baptismal regeneration. Two separate entities. It's just like I love chocolate cake, Sister JoJo. I love chocolate cake. I also love broccoli. I'm a huge fan of broccoli. Now, if you put those in a blender and mix those together, you'll have the same reaction Sister Barb just had, which was, bull. You put together a chocolate cake broccoli smoothie, and no one's going to like that. Okay, nasty. But that's what they were doing. They were mixing two separate concepts. One had the outward showing. One was the first step of admittance that I'm a sinner, God exists, Christ is my Savior, that first step. Okay? Now they're mixing the two together because one seemed ceremonial, the other one was important. Let's put them together. Okay? So that's where we see this beginning shortly after Christ. It's like, come on, guys. Like they couldn't even let the truth last for a while. But we're starting to see this happen. Okay, next four. Everyone following? Everyone good? Okay, everyone understand why that is an incorrect doctrine. Okay. The next 5 bullets. Who has that?
The next serious error to begin creeping in, and which seems from some historians to have begun in the same century, and which may be said to have been an inevitable consequence of the baptismal regeneration idea, was a change in the subjects of baptism. Since baptism had been declared to be an agency or means to salvation by some erring churches, then the sooner baptism takes place, the better. Hence arose infant baptism. Prior to this, believers and believers only were regarded as proper subjects for baptism. Sprinkling and pouring are not now referred to.
Go one more.
These came in much later. For several centuries, infants, like others, were immersed.
So can you see if we're going to blend these two together, we're going to put a first faith experience, broccoli, baptism, chocolate cake, and we're going to mash them into broccoli cake, and we're going to blend them, then why not do it sooner? Remember, all of this happens over time. This isn't on a Monday they're deciding this, and Tuesday they're doing it. This is over decades. Somebody raises their hand and says, hey, we should put broccoli and chocolate cake together. Let's mix them. Yay. And then, oh my goodness, this is over time. So what's happening now is if that's the case, so we change a truth and we assume a truth to be a lie. So now we have to go down the path of a lie, of a false teaching. So assuming that false teaching is true, we now have to start changing other things down the path. So if we're blending these two together, broccoli cake, if we're mixing these two things together, then the sooner we can get people in the water to be saved, which is their thinking, the better. How many people have heard of this infant baptism? I think they call it a christening now, right? This is a very legit thing. You see it on TV. It's sort of assumed that a baby's going to be christened. And so at the time, sprinkling and pouring would all come down the road. Remember, well, you held the baby underwater a little long. You should probably not. Well, what if we just pour? Same thing. What if we just sprinkle? Same thing. And so all that came much later, but for right now, they're taking babies because the concept is that you have salvation at this baptism. We're going to take a baby and we're going to go like that. Okay? Two separate entities, broccoli and chocolate cake, blended together. Because one had the outward appearance of something important, and the other was an important first step. So let's blend them together. Let it be remembered that changes like these mentioned were not made in a day or even a year. They came about slowly, never within all the churches. Some of the churches vigorously repudiated them, right? It makes sense. If you've got New Testament churches who are buying this stuff, you've got to break fellowship from them. You can't accept a doctrine that is clear heresy like this. This concept has no place in the Bible. Jesus didn't teach this. He taught the opposite of this. And so now you start to see fellowship issues coming about. Okay? And so much of that in the 3rd century, AD 51, there was a split. Loyal churches declared non-fellowship for those churches which accepted and practiced these errors. Thus came about the real first separation among the churches. Sadly, these type of separations still occur, and typically over different subjects, but those separations still exist. There are some landmarks, though. There are some things that we have to hold tight. And if somebody comes up to us and says, hey, you should start teaching that you can lose your salvation, that's not welcome here. That's not a doctrine that's welcome here because it's not biblical. That's heresy. And so that's, I believe, part of the pastor's job is to protect the church from stuff like that. Not to say these didn't, because they may have tried. But it is really the pastor's role, the leadership's role to protect churches from garbage like this. And so that's what we see happening in 251. Thus, it'll be noted that during the first 3 centuries, 3 important and vital changes from the teachings of Christ and his apostles had their beginnings. One significant event took place. The change of the New Testament idea of bishop and church government. This change grew rapidly, more pronounced and complete and hurtful. The change from the New Testament teachings as to regeneration to baptismal regeneration, and the change from believer's baptism to infant baptism. This last one, however, didn't become general or even more frequent for about another century. Not talking a lot of time here, guys. They're already putting a spin on all of this. So this brought to memory Deuteronomy 4, 1 and 2, which Brother Ace is going to read nice and loud for us.
Now, Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I teach you to observe, that you may live and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers is giving you. You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God which I command you.
The same rule applied for Israel under covenant with God. The same rule applied with the New Testament church, the new Israel of God, his New Testament church. The same rule applied. Although there is liberty and no law, he didn't give the church law and liberty to alter what he said. There is a plan, there is a path. Jesus laid it out, established his church. You're to not take from it. So the same God with the same mentality of this is my word, not your liberty to change it if you would like. Okay, that's lesson 3. Thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah.
I guess it made me think right now because as a baby, I was christened in the Lutheran religion with my godparents, and it's you look at how they transformed this because you were talking about the rituals and stuff, like it was holy water. I don't know this, but they use the holy water and they have their sayings with it.
Yep.
And I guess also made me think too when I first started dating Julie and she took me here. Now that before these lessons knew this, but when I first started coming here, I thought this was I a new religion, a new
Yeah.
like something,
Yeah.
because I was raised, my dad was Catholic, and then we became Lutheran because he didn't like Catholics, and so
Yep.
it just makes me think how ignorant, I guess, or naive I was.
Yeah.
In my younger days.
But I think that's what people do is they get comfortable in the lane that they're in. And so when they're comfortable in that lane, they don't want to change. At some point, someone may look at them wrong or, whatever, that sort of thing. But really, it's more if you. So Martin Luther is an example. We're going to look at him much down the road because we will have gone through Constantine and Islam and all that before we get to Martin Luther. But Martin Luther had a feeling, had a vibe that the Catholic Church wasn't right. And so he announced it, and he was a high up, walked away from the Catholic Church. Great. But everyone has that choice to go find the truth. Remember, if I'm going to be with you till the end of the age, then there's something that he has to be with. If the gates of hell won't prevail against it, then there has to be something in existence that the gates of hell won't prevail against. So that's what our chart is. It's that line. So when you wake up and say, oh my goodness, I don't even know what this is. Like, this religion is crazy. Then go find the truth because there's a truth out there to be found. And that's where people struggle because it's not important enough to them. And so the whole ceremony, the pomp and circumstance, right? There's a free buffet lunch usually afterwards, right? They're a very nice ceremony. But what has happened is the Lord's New Testament churches were starting to do this. And that's where the fellowship has to break because this has no place in the Lord's New Testament churches. Now, eventually, what we're going to see is now generation after generation of babies being baptized, of little Erics running around for 2 generations, running around. How about this? If you, which this is exactly how it happened, this church, which you're a member of, did not accept that baptism. So now the re-baptizers is a name given to them because Anna is re-baptizers, Anabaptists. Because they weren't taking that as a legitimate baptism. And so now the split is definite. You're there, I'm here, do whatever you want to do. But if they come to our side, the New Testament church, we got to rebaptize them. That's causing problems now. Especially when it's law that you can't. Okay, so we're going to get into that. Good segue, Brother Eric. You didn't even know, but thank you. Good job. Now, for lesson 4, I did something a little different because it is fun to tell people to take the next 4 or 5 bullets. Instead, I numbered them. Okay, so it's going to be a little easier. So to start off, we'll do this for a few more minutes. To start off, who wants to take 1 through 5? Nice and loud.
When we left off, we read about some teachings
Heretical.
that began to take root in the Lord's New Testament churches. These teachings seem to focus on baptism, which by this time had become a rite of passage in other religions.
Stop right there. Thank you. This is what we're seeing. The concept of baptism has been stolen, hijacked, and is now being used as a rite of passage for these other groups. So these other groups are starting to use the outward show, the outward action of baptism to include in their religion. So for example, this early group takes it and says, we're going to blend that with first faith, salvation. And because the sooner you do that, the better, we got to start getting them as babies. And then they're good. They're totally good. We've mixed the two together. They're good for their life. Okay? So we're starting to see the concept of baptism. We saw that last time, stolen. Go ahead.
They seemed to like the visuals of baptism, like an outward pledge for their religion as well. This concept of dipping a person who is choosing to make a commitment into a false religion was a direct theft of what God created. He created this for his covenant people, for those who had taken a step of step one of commitment toward God, and we're now committing to his full plan.
I liked your reading so much, I'd go through number 8 there. That was some good reading. Good job.
That is what baptism is, a desire for total submission to God and his full plan through his New Testament church. We saw where these other religions took what was sacred and made
Common. Sorry.
or commo.
Or
They made
como?
commo and for their use, even altering the very act itself to fit their own narrative. Remember that concept because we will look into the long history of other groups doing just that, stealing what was once meant for God's people and God's plan and making it their own.
Ooh, so keep that in mind. We're going to take bits and elements and things and elements and stuff, and we're going to take it. We're going to take it, okay? When I say the word priest, what do you think of? Catholics. Why? I always think of the collar, right? I'm going to get one of those. Like the collar, priests. Look at the Old Testament. Levites, right? Priests. Jesus says kings and priests, right? Talks about the New Testament church. How about saints? Same thing, right? These terms are stolen and used for something else. Right now, when I say saints, Brother Albert thinks of New Orleans, not accurate, and that's okay. But saints were clearly used for people, church members in the New Testament, to the saints at wherever. But now you go to the Holy Land, if people were to go there, and they see St. Peter's Cathedral or St. Anthony's whatever, stolen, carjacked, without the car, just jacked. They took it. And so they've used these terms and taken them straight from God's plan. All right. Who's with me on 9 through, who wants 9 through 16? Who else wants 9 through 16? Sister Becky, do it.
All of this is straight from the devil, meant to deceive and distract from God's truth. In fact, baptismal regeneration and infant baptism have, according to the testimony of well-established history, caused the shedding of more Christian blood as the centuries have gone by than all other errors combined, or than possibly have all wars. Over 50 million. That's million.
I added that.
Christians died martyr deaths, mainly because of the rejection of these two errors during the period of the Dark Ages alone. The period was about 1,200 years, or about 12 or 13 centuries. With some quick math, we see that the approximate total of days in that period is 428,666 days. 50 million killed divided by the number of days equals about 1/14 of our brethren killed per day. This realization is simply incredible to fathom, and with that knowledge and appreciation, let's continue our study and get back to our timeline in history.
114 a day on average. Now, obviously, there were contests and big groups in which hundreds were slaughtered and maybe days where there were fewer. But shoot, on average, 114 a day. If there was a tragedy where 114 people died, we would hear about it. We'd know about it. And that could happen if another wheel falls off a plane. That could probably happen. But there's a few hundred people in a plane, right? That would be a huge story. And then the next day it happens again. And then that's a huge story. But then the next day it happens again, and it happens again and again and again and again for a dozen centuries. It's crazy. It's crazy. So that's what we're up against. That's who we are attached to. So a turning point occurs in 312, one that is historically considered as the beginning of the flexed muscle of the Catholic Church. We're going to study a guy named Constantine. We'll do this page and then we'll call it. In this year, Constantine the Great is ruling Rome, and he's about to embark on a critical battle against the rebel leader Maxentius. Maxentius' forces were twice the size of Constantine's, and he organized them in long lines facing the battle plane with their backs to the river. So this is like all of the young Padawans and Luke Skywalker going up against as rebels, going up against the establishment. Do I have that right, Brother Armando? Okay. All right. So it's being led by a rebel force to go up against the ruler in Rome. Okay. And we can see it's pretty imbalanced. A lot of people liked the rebel force, Maxentius, and so twice the size of Constantine. Constantine's army arrived on the field bearing unfamiliar symbols on their standards and shields. We're going to get into that here in just a second. The historian Eusebius describes a vision that Constantine had while marching at midday, headed toward this battle. How many people have ever heard this story? Constantine and his vision that he had. Okay, so here's what happens. Here's how it is described. Eusebius describes, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of the light in the heavens above the sun, and bearing the inscription, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. Constantine deployed his own forces along with the whole length of Maxentius's line. He ordered his cavalry to charge, and they broke Maxentius' cavalry. And he sent his infantry against Maxentius' infantry, pushing many into the Tiber, where they were slaughtered and drowned. The battle was brief. Maxentius' troops were broken before the first charge. All right, we'll go for a few more bullets. Hold on. His horse guards and praetorians initially held their position, but they broke under the force of a Constantinian cavalry charge. They also broke ranks and fled to the river. Maxentius rode with him and attempted to cross the bridge of boats, but he was pushed into the Tiber and drowned by the mass of his fleeing soldiers. Constantine entered Rome on October 29th, 312, and staged a grand entrance into the city and was met with great jubilation. Now remember, he's had this epiphany. He's had this vision, which is interesting. Keep this in mind, you guys. This vision that comes out of nowhere where he sees something and realizes, okay, this is the course I have to take. Remember this when we study Islam. Okay? Just remember, just put this in the back of your head. Unlike his predecessors, Constantine did not make the trip to Capitoline Hill and perform sacrifices to the temple of Jupiter. So previous, for battles and victories, they would go right to the temple of Jupiter, previous rulers, and they would offer sacrifices, victorious sacrifices. Yay, we won. Thank you, Jupiter. We did it. Okay, he did not do that. Instead, Maxentius's body was actually fished out of the river, decapitated, and his head was paraded through the streets for all to see. So again, this is common in warfare. It's a show of force that this is what happens to you if you dissent. As a rebel going against the government, this is what will happen to you. Keep that in mind as we continue to study. Constantine referred to himself as the liberator. Okay. And rededicated all structures built by Maxentius to himself. I put this in here for Brother Eric, including the temple of Romulus and Basilia of Maxentius. See, Romulans were around even back then. The temple of Romulus. Basilia of Maxentius. In this Basilia, a stone structure was erected of Constantine holding this symbol, the laborum, in his hand, and it had this inscription: by this sign, Constantine had freed Rome from the yoke of the tyrant. Now look at the bottom of the page. That is a stone bust of Constantine in his Lloyd Christmas haircut. And, that's for you, Brother Paul, and the symbol that he started to parade with. So any of the coinage prior to this epiphany did not include this cross on it. And so we see that change after his epiphany. You look at this symbol, this is what they carried back into Rome after the victory. And this was on, and they've unearthed several coins, different coins, had this symbol on it. You can see the back of that coin down there. The reign of Constantine established a precedent for the emperors to have great influence and authority in the early religious councils. So now he's going to call together a meeting because now he's had this epiphany. He's had this vision, and now he's going to start blending a couple of things together. Broccoli, chocolate cake? No, even worse. Seaweed and muffins. We're going to mix government and religion. And we're going to put those together because now he's a religious leader. He's not the emperor of Rome. He's a religious leader, which was common. They all gave to the temple of Jupiter. But now we've found a different God. One that Rome doesn't agree with. The Roman Empire doesn't agree with. And so Constantine is now a Christian, everybody. And we're going to see next week what he does with that power and influence that he has on the Roman government. Remember, he's in charge of the government. So he's going to start blending together a couple of things that should not be together. How do we know they shouldn't be together? Because Jesus himself did not do this. Jesus did not influence government. Jesus did not overthrow government. Jesus did not create his own government. Jesus had no desire to create a government. His government is eternal. His kingdom is coming, not for this earth. So that's what we see. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Constantine, who knew? Kind of a thug. That's okay. Bloody Christmas. All right. No thoughts? Sweet. Has anyone heard this before? Good. Kind of, yeah? Okay. So this is a skew off the book. This is a little deep dive into Constantine because I want to see what's in his head. It's like what we did with the 7 churches. I'm going to see what's going on in that area. Like, give me some history on who this guy was, what made him tick. Clearly this guy had an ego. He tore down the rebel statues and put up his own. He renamed any ones that he didn't tear down. He made him his own. Anything that had Maxentius's face on it, he tore down. Anything that was just something that had his name on it, he chiseled it off and put his name on there. Eventually we're going to see a split. We're going to see some other things. You've probably heard of the town Istanbul, Turkey, that used to be called Constantinople. Like things like that. We're going to see different things where Constantine's influence is very strong. And down the road, this influence will influence hundreds of years later. This idea and concept and what they've created will influence a young homeless boy who will take a look at this and want to mimic much of what was already created. So we'll get into that too as we continue to study. So we're about the 4th century right now. Yeah.